In this video on my table here today, we essentially have the history of Nintendo first-party controllers for all of their consoles, dating back to the NES back in 1985, all the way up to the Nintendo Switch today. And I find this stuff fascinating with the evolution of all their different controllers, the features they had. I wanted to do this video today going back, looking at the beginning and seeing, pretty much from where we came from with Nintendo to where we are now, and just see the different innovations and how things kind of built off of one another. So obviously we got to start with the NES. The NES, this controller, the rectangle that we have here, back in 1985, and Nintendo actually patented the D-pad on this. They used a similar D-pad on some of their Game & Watch systems, their little handhelds as well. And at that time, they said, hey, you know what? We're going to patent this thing and protect this specific design for 20 years. So, that patent expired 2005. And you didn't see, reputable, legit companies for the most part using the same style as Nintendo. But this is what a lot of us, grew up with and grew accustomed to and loved back then. I mean, it wasn't the first controller I ever used, but the NES for sure was a system where it was like, holy crap, this is video games. This is the future for me anyway. I had an Atari 2600 prior to that, but very basic controller. You got your A, B, select and start, and then your little D-pad. Sharp corners, it's a rectangle, right? Kind of would, you'd get like little indentations, annoy your hands a little bit from extended play. But overall, it wasn't a bad controller. Simple, straight to the point, it frickin' worked. I love this thing. Now, back in 1993, they released the dog bone. You got the little circles here, the straight piece, looks like a bone, right? So everything's kind of more curved, a more comfortable feel than the original controller. So this came with the NES top loader. You had the curved back, everything, even the buttons were curved. There was a raised piece of plastic over the buttons. It was angled. The select and start were angled. The D-pad was a little bit bigger than the original. It was a more comfortable controller. Now, I didn't have a top loader back then. I moved on from the NES at that time, so I'd always use this, and I kind of still, when I use an NES, I typically default to this, even though I do like this controller as well. It's just, this is Nintendo for me, the NES, so I love this form factor. Now we got to move on to the Super Nintendo, right? And for those of you who are very detail orientated, you will immediately notice that yes, this is not the original Super Nintendo controller that came out in 1991. This is actually a version that came out in 1997 with the SNES Junior. So they changed it as far as a couple small details. Essentially the same controller, your L and R, your A, B, X, Y, D-pad, select and start. Essentially the same controller, but they removed the Super Nintendo printing right there. It had the logo, and they molded in the Nintendo logo. I think one of the reasons they did that, because on the back here, you will see the Famicom and the Super Nintendo logo molded into the plastic. So I feel like, I'm pretty sure they didn't put Super Nintendo on the front so they could reuse this mold for multiple regions type of thing. The model number SNS 102. I love the Super Nintendo controller. It's one that I still really enjoy to this day. Has that curvature to it. It's comfortable in the hands. For 6-button like fighting games though, I wasn't always the greatest with those games because I could never get accustomed to using the L and R as buttons that you constantly use. If they were secondary, occasionally you used them, I was fine with them, but I know a lot of people were okay with them. Just me personally, with Street Fighter, for example, I would change the strong attacks to X and A, the medium attacks and the weak attacks to the shoulder buttons. That way, I wasn't using the weak buttons as often, but they would be up there. A lot of people, even to this day, hey, the better fighting game controller was, either 6-button Genesis or the Sega Saturn controller. It had an amazing D-pad as well, the Sega Saturn controller. And I tend to agree, but this is what I had at the time. This is what I had to get used to. And I absolutely love this controller, and I still love using it to this day. But yeah, not too much in the way of criticism. It's just kind of, it would have been cool if it was just straight up 6 face buttons, and had the shoulders up here. But there you go, Super Nintendo. Now we got to move on to a controversial one. the Nintendo 64. This came out in 1996, so it actually, this Super Nintendo controller came out a year after this, or, you know, obviously there's different colors, variations and whatnot, but yeah, Nintendo 64 came out in 1996. Their first and only controller with an expansion slot. As far as their home consoles go, you could use a controller pack for, you know, saving games. Not a lot of games used it. A lot of games typically saved to the game pack, but there were a good few that used this. So you had that for saving games. Rumble pack to get some rumble. Pretty cool controller. I believe there was a microphone as well for the Pikachu game where you talk to his ass. But yeah, why is this controversial? Trident shape, the three-prong design. Some people feel this was not very comfortable. Some people, I remember even to this day, I would always hear people say this controller was designed for one purpose only. It was designed for use with Super Mario 64. And I always kind of believed that, but when you look into it and you see some of the representatives from Nintendo over the years comment on it, it's kind of up in the air the way you want to perceive it, but essentially they said it wasn't necessarily that the controller was designed for the game, it's that the game and the controller influenced each other. And it just kind of, they both came about from one another, influencing each other, right? Now, I think I never had a big issue with this other than the limp stick syndrome happening as the way the analog stick was designed. You know, you would grind away at that bowl and it would get limp, or you'd get blisters on your hand from playing Mario Party type of thing and wear out the analog stick. There's replacements now, like I use the Kitschbent stuff, but this one's pretty tight. It's okay. You know, for a lot of games you would play it this way, and if you have bigger hands, like your knuckles would touch, so some people don't like that. For me, that's the way it is for me now. That's the way it was for me back then, but I just grew so accustomed to it and played all my Nintendo 64 games this way. I love this controller. I mean, I don't really have too much of an issue. It feels comfortable for me. I love that trigger button underneath. But the way this was essentially designed is like Nintendo, you know, they had 3D movement in mind. You know, and they kind of revolutionized things. They weren't the first to have a joystick, but, you know, having an analog stick here kind of became the norm. But the way it looks like this was designed was, Nintendo was like, you know, and I've even heard or read where they've stated, or it's been stated anyway, that Nintendo was like, okay, 3D movement's going to be important going forward, so we have to have this, right? But then they also felt like there was still going to be a lot of 2D movement games, or games built in 2D space that required 2D movement, where this wouldn't be the best for it. So they essentially designed two controllers into one. 3D movement this way, and then your standard this way. So two controllers in one. I don't remember playing too many games holding it this way, but there were some that played that way. You had your shoulder buttons up top and then that trigger underneath. But I still like this controller. It's, you know, I got a lot of nostalgia for it. I love the N64, and I still use these to this day, 90% of the time. I know there's a lot of third-party stuff out there, but I usually default to that. So let's go ahead and move forward to the Gamecube. This is an interesting one. You got all digital buttons, you got two analog sticks. They essentially took the C buttons, turned it to an analog stick. The prototype of the Gamecube controller, I've seen it before, where it was kind of elongated more, so it was like wider. And I believe the B button was like a jelly bean, kidney bean shape instead of a circle underneath, like the X and the Y. But yeah, like the N64 didn't have an X and a Y, so they returned to the, you know, Super Nintendo. Let's get an X and a Y on there, right? But kind of weird layout. Kind of got used to it, but all digital buttons other than the hybrid analog digital shoulder buttons, these triggers here. So essentially they were pressure sensitive up to a point, right? This one's digital, the Z button. These guys, if you just click down, as soon as it clicks, it registers as a digital press. So it was like a 2-in-1 button. Thought that was really interesting. Came out 2001, has built-in rumble. Now later on, they did release a controller I really like, the Wavebird. So this came out in 2002. Wireless RF frequency came with a dongle. You could change the channel. Took two AA batteries, kind of a light controller without batteries in it because there is no rumble. Works exactly the same as this controller. It's the same shape other than the battery compartment kind of fills in the back there, but everything's laid out the same. Wonderful controller, harder to get nowadays for a reasonable price and good condition. But there we go. Gamecube, awesome controller. These were, you know, Gamecube controllers were re-released numerous times over the years. for the Wii U, the Switch, you know, Smash Bros. People love this controller, right? Moving on, the Wii. This is an interesting one. The Wiimote and the Nunchuck in 2006. First controller from Nintendo using Bluetooth. The controller communicates with the sensor bar, you know, for pointing cursors with infrared. So you had that there, pointing it around. Has an accelerometer and a gyroscope built into it. Not the Nunchuck. Nunchuck's just buttons and an analog stick. You could hold it left-handed, right-handed. Didn't really matter. So that was a good thing. The Wiimote has a speaker built into it, and it has rumble. So some games would communicate to you. You'd get sound effects coming out of that. It's kind of neat. The one thing I found really interesting with this controller is that it has memory built into it for a couple different reasons. So it has 6 kilobytes of memory dedicated to store Mii characters to share with other consoles. So you save that straight to this, right? That was kind of interesting. But it also utilizes 4,000 bytes of memory for game use. And what would you use that for? Some games you could save your specific controller configuration to that specific controller. That's kind of cool. I did not know that, actually. I don't think I ever utilized that. Or if I did, I didn't know it. So you had that saving configurations, saving profiles, and other kind of game information stuff could be saved to this. Now, you may be seeing, hey, we have that Motion Plus expansion added here, as later on in 2009, they did release this expansion pack that had like an extra accelerometer, a gyroscope type thing built into it to have more like capable motion sensing is what the point was. And later on, they did incorporate that into the Wiimote in 2010. They made a Wii Remote Plus that incorporated all that into it and kept it the same size instead of being elongated like this. That way you could still use your Wii Motion Plus controller and like steering wheel and other accessories and whatnot. Otherwise with this, you'd have to remove that and you know, attach it to the light gun accessory type thing or the steering wheel, all that kind of stuff. So pretty cool. The other thing they released during the Wii was the Classic Controller and the Classic Controller Pro. I do not have a normal Classic controller, but essentially is very similar Super Nintendo style controller, but the analog sticks were closer together and the shoulder buttons were right next to each other. So this is the Pro version. You have the shoulders back there, the ZR and ZL behind. Just a more comfortable controller. The analog sticks are spaced apart a little more. So just a cool little controller. Mainly, I think these were used for like virtual console stuff. A lot of games used it as well. But yeah, like WiiWare and Virtual Console, these were good controllers to have. Pretty cool stuff. All these, the Wiimotes, all the Classic Controller Pro can still be used with Nintendo's next system, which is the Wii U, which we recently talked about in a video, taking a look at a whole little bundle I got. The Wii U gamepad, really comfortable controller. This is what came stock. This was the controller you got. You wanted other controllers, you needed Wiimotes, you know, whatever Pro controllers, you had to buy them separate. This is what came with the system. This is the stock controller, and they did not sell this separately. Kind of crazy. I wish they would have. That way there would be more available out there to get. But this gamepad, very comfortable with the butt cheeks, the lip under there, the way the ZR and ZL sit on that lip there. It's a really nice controller. So you have a 6.2-inch resistive touchscreen that is 854 by 480 resolution, stereo speakers built in, headphone jack up top, charge port right there, all digital buttons, right? You have digital buttons all over this thing, front-facing camera, and then you also had a 9-axis motion gyroscope detection built into this thing for motion controls, has rumble, an infrared array. That way, this could be used as like, you know, emulating a Wii sensor bar. And the one cool and interesting thing is that this isn't Bluetooth. It's not like 2.4 gigahertz wireless. It's a modified Wi-Fi protocol to connect to the main console for like low latency transmission. Thought that was kind of interesting. Really, really neat controller. It's integral to the system, but it's its controller. That's what it came with, right? Now, at the same time, when the Wii U came out in 2012, you could also get a Wii U Pro controller. This was Bluetooth, 1300 milliamp hour battery that's built into this thing, which is actually the same battery used in the 3DS and 2DS, and can last for up to 80 hours. This controller always, like, that's the biggest positive, is how long the battery life was for this thing. All digital buttons, no rumble built in, which is probably why, you know, this whole thing was, you know, lasted so long with the batteries. There's really no other, you know, anything extra to it. It's a very basic controller, but it gets the job done. doesn't have gyro, doesn't have motion controls, and that can be an issue for some games like Breath of the Wild, other games that may want you to use, motion control. So you have to use this or swap back and forth type of thing. That's one of the biggest negatives with this controller. So there you go. I mean, yeah, we could go back and use all this stuff as well. The Wii U played Wii games. A lot of games supported these other controllers. But now, moving to present time, or at least from 2017 to present time, the Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch shipped with the notorious Joycons. So these things are interesting. They have a lot of features. Not my favorite Nintendo controller ever, but this is what shipped with the Switch. You got the Joycons, which you can use them in numerous different ways. Came with this little attachment so you could use it in a more traditional control manner, but I've never really used this thing. It's all scuffed up. It's been sitting in like a drawer forever. I think it's from my original Switch. But yeah, I've never really used that thing. You could have these attached to the Switch itself, use it in handheld mode. Now these Joy-Cons and the Joy-Con drift, oh my God, I've traded in Joy-Con so many times with Nintendo. But these things, they connect to the system via Bluetooth, and the right Joy-Con is a little more special than the left one. The reason being is that it has an IR depth tracking camera built into it and an NFC reader, for your amiibos and whatnot. So that little IR sensor, it can be used to decipher shapes and motion. Kind of interesting. These controllers, they have 525 milliamp hour batteries built into them. Both of them have accelerometer, gyroscope stuff built in, so you can use them for motion control and tracking and whatnot. Then you also have that HD rumble, which was one of the biggest selling points of this thing, or one of the features they hyped up the most. In the HD rumble is for like a realistic feel with interacting with certain objects. I remember they showing like tilting it with ice cubes or something. I don't know, but most games never even really used the HD rumble fully. Most of them used it as more of a standard approach to rumble. They just didn't really fully utilize the HD. A lot of games do, but most of them don't. So that's one thing. And then the other interesting thing with these is there's no traditional D-pad, a first for Nintendo. For the stock controller that came with the system, no traditional D-pad. And one of the reasons for that, I guess, is that you could, break this apart and use it as two separate controllers. Each one has like your shoulder buttons on the top there. You can also slide that thing on and have it as a wrist strap and hold it that way. I don't think I've ever really used those. I don't even know where they're at right now. But yeah, it's kind of weird. You just have these buttons, play it this way, kind of awkward. No traditional D-pad, just the little tiny analog stick that doesn't have much throw to it. They're not horrible, but that Joy-Con drift is definitely not a joke. I mean, class action lawsuits aside, kind of wish that wasn't a problem here. But a lot of people say most analog sticks suffer from that over time, but I think it was just the Switch suffered from it a lot quicker, and that's why there was a big problem with it. But yeah, some people like these, some people don't. They're not the most comfortable for me. And that's why, as I mostly play my Switch in, docked mode on the TV, I love the Pro Controller. This kind of, brought forth from all the different controllers over the years, and, Nintendo kind of embraced, like, let's get all the features built into this thing and, get a good controller going. Some people like it, some people don't. I like this controller. It has Bluetooth, has NFC built into it, a 1300 milliamp hour battery. You have your accelerometer, gyroscope, all digital buttons on this thing. It's just an all-around good controller for the most part. I love the clearness to it, the transparency. It's a comfortable controller for me. I really dig this one. Could it be better? Sure, any of these controllers could be better, but starting out from way back 1985, going from this all the way to this, and this. It's an interesting journey, and I just wanted to kind of talk about it with you guys. I mean, I still have a lot of love for most of these controllers. Not my favorite with the Switch anyway, but this is probably my least favorite out of all of these controllers. But a little bit here for everyone, depending on if you like Nintendo or not. I love Nintendo, love the history behind this stuff, and it was really cool to go through and kind of see everything laid out at once. So really do appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. What's your favorite Nintendo controller? That said, I will catch you guys next time. You guys a big ass blurry thumb butt. Bye.